Today, I'm very excited to continue our series of conversations by welcoming Dr. Jung Pak, who is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department, where she is responsible for overseeing U.S. relations with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. And if that wasn't enough to keep her busy, she also serves as Deputy Special Representative for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea. Prior to arriving at State, Dr. Pak was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution for over 3 years, where she focused on Korean Peninsula issues, East Asia regional dynamics, and transnational threats related to proliferation, cybersecurity, and climate change. She has also held senior positions at the Central Intelligence Agency for over 8 years, including stints as Deputy National Intelligence Officer. She has received several awards for her superior analytic accomplishments. Before her career in national security, Dr. Pak taught U.S. history in New York City. She received her PhD from Columbia University and is the author of the book, Becoming Kim Jong Un. Taking the privilege of the chair, I get to ask the first question. Looking back at the beginning of your career, what initially attracted you to foreign affairs? And what steps and processes led you to decide on this as your career? In other words, what is your origin story, please?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me on the webinar. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you and to the audience. I really welcome questions during the Q&A. What is the origin story? For me, in my bio, in the State Department bio, I made sure to include that my degree was a PhD in US history. There's sometimes the assumption that if you're doing foreign policy, of course you majored in political science or of course international relations, but my degree was in US history. So my origin story really has its anchor and its foundation in the United States. How is the United States the United States? What are some of the processes and the people and the trends in history that created the country that we live in now? And specifically, it was very much focused on African American history. So my origin story and how I came to foreign affairs is through African American history. I went into the PhD program at Columbia thinking that I was going to be an academic of the Civil War and Reconstruction, as well as civil rights. For me, African American history is the story of America. I would say that my intellectual anchor is W.B. Du Bois and the double consciousness that he talks about. And as a first generation, as an immigrant, as a woman living in the United States, that was always such a resonating theme. And in the course of my studies, I've always been interested in how ideas came over by ship, by airplane, by books, and how the United States was created by all sorts of ideas and peoples. And I really wanted to study that history of it. As I was working on my studies, my dissertation, I found myself focused on Americans going abroad. In my case, looking at African Americans who went abroad and served in wars, but would come back to the United States to suffer some of the same discrimination that they didn't necessarily feel overseas. And they were looking at, they were serving the United States, they were fighting for democracy, but coming back to not feel like they were living in a democratic society. So in the course of my dissertation, going through the archives, the National Archives, seeing these declassified memos, thousands of them, and I thought to myself, I could do that. I could be the American going overseas or studying foreign affairs and writing about what's going on and representing the United States. And that was really the spark that drew me into this business. And I was lucky to have had lots of allies and mentors to shepherd me through that and how to find that path.
That is great. Interesting path. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Yackley, our Rusk Fellow, who will take on the rest of the questions. We actually have a pair of historians having a conversation, so this should be a good chat. So with that, I'm going to move into the audience and turn the chair over to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bodine, and good morning to all of our participants. Before we continue, I'd like to ask our participants to begin formulating questions they would like to pose to Dr. Pak. We'll open up the Q&A box shortly, and you can enter your questions there. And if you could, please include your affiliation. At the end of the interview, we'll turn to those questions. Dr. Pak, thank you very much for joining us today. All of us are products of our backgrounds and our previous experiences, whether it's as individuals or members of a family or in communities. Could you tell me a bit more about your background and how that your identity shaped your perspective on the United States? You mentioned some of it with respect to your research, but on a more personal level.
Yeah, I mentioned that I was a first generation an immigrant to this country and studying in the, going to school in the country, and I was very young when we came to the United States. But I think that you get to see the United States from a different set of eyes. And I mentioned the idea of double consciousness, to be Korean, to be American, and to have those different identities. But the first and foremost, I would say American, right? Because America is such a wonderful amalgamation of all sorts of experiences. And so what I find to be so rewarding about this job is interpreting the United States to the rest of the world. And also, being that resource, but also showing that America has a lot of different faces and experiences. And I think it, in a way, hopefully that resonates among different populations as I go overseas and talk to folks from different countries to talk about US interests, but also how we should align our interests with their interests and how we can be working together. I would also argue that this is as a child of parents and family who didn't necessarily have a lot of language capabilities, that interpretation is part and parcel of your youth.
Right.
And to boil it down into the most essential parts, I think that's a skill that I developed as having had to interpret the United States to my parents, right? And to interpret my parents to the rest of the United States. I think, those are set skills that I think that I'm still using.
Right. Very interesting. Given your role, do you find that when you're traveling abroad and you're representing the United States, do others, your counterparts, should they accept you as fully American? Do you sometimes get questions like, yeah, you represent the United States, but where are you really from? That kind of suggestion?
Right. No.
Good.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
As somebody, as a representative of the United States, and I kind of expected some of that, but I have not. There's no question about what country I represent, and no question about identity so much. I think when I do travel in Asia, though, there's always you understand because the Asian way. Which isn't always true, right?
Right.
Because they're different experiences. But I was glad to see the acceptance. But it also reminds me of the power of this position. Right. That this is not me as an individual, but this is as a representative of the United States, representing the secretary, representing the president, representing the whole of the United States government on these issues. It really shows the power of the US and the people who work in public service. Right,
absolutely. You've spent most of your career focusing on East Asia, but you've done it in a variety of contexts as an academic, working at a think tank, CIA analyst, now at the State Department. Could you talk about maybe the different ways your kind of analytic perspective on the subjects that you've covered, how those have changed in different roles that you've had, be it at the CIA, in your current role, or at the think tank?
I've had the privilege of doing all sorts of different jobs over the course of the past couple of decades. And I think as an academic, you're really digging, as a historian, you're digging into the past and really putting a spotlight on a specific portion of the past. but that's to try to describe and understand the present.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of in academia, you're digging into conversations, the personal histories, the oral interviews of people remembering things from the past. Joe, you're nodding because you've done all of this as an academic. And the archival work, which is about this memo that was written in a particular period, particular moment, but which also represents the particular perspectives of that individual. And there's a reason that individual's memo is in the archives, right? Because that person was related to the government or associated with the government that required that those documents be saved. Lots of documents are not saved, right? Diaries, regular person who's not necessarily related to any kind of institution, and those are some of the more marginalized people. So there's that aspect of doing Asia or these types of studies. At the agency, the way I describe the agency versus State Department, and this is in the most simplistic terms, so please, with that caveat, with the agency, I found myself identifying what the problem is. So the agency is, how do you identify the problem? State Department, I see my role is, what do I do about it?
Right.
And that's in the most simplistic terms, right? We are, of course, State Department, we're also identifying problems. At the agency is also trying to figure out how to solve those problems. But I think in a nutshell, State Department, you can be, you're forward leaning on what to do about those problems or try to stem the problem before it blossoms into a bigger problem.
Right. Going back to the CIA, could you talk specifically about the role of diversity in analytic work? Having a more diverse workforce is good for any company, for any government agency, but specifically in analytic work, the different perspectives that are opened up by having a more diverse workforce. Is that something that you experienced at CIA? Is that something that CIA is working on itself to try to recruit a more diverse workforce?
Yeah, when I was at the agency, and I'm 100% believer in the absolute necessity for diversity of all types when you're doing analysis and when you're doing this kind of work. You can't do without it, and you're doing it without even knowing that you're doing it. And so for me, it's never been just a moniker that HR department, says that we have to be doing, but it's an absolute critical necessity when you're doing, and which could mean the difference between success, policy success, or an intel failure.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have multiple eyes on a set of problems, if you don't have lived experience and different sets of lived experiences looking at a problem, you're going to see the answer that you want to see,
right,
versus the answer that needs to be that needs to float up to the surface, so that we can work on those problems.
Right, absolutely. You've excelled in a variety of foreign affairs positions and institutions. Given your time at State, can you compare how State is doing compared to academia, to the think tank community about diversity? The State Department's made a big push in recent years. We've made some progress, but we've fallen short in other areas.
Mm-hmm.
You have a sense of how State compares to these other institutions where you've worked?
My knowledge is all dated, so I don't think I'm not sure that a comparison would be useful. But I do think that the idea of DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, hopefully has seeped into the collective bloodstream,
mm-hmm,
and the necessity for that in everything that we do. That it's like the air that we breathe, and that and how we do business. And I don't think I think generally, I hope that it's that as a policy matter, I think we definitely need the higher level, the leadership to say, this is what's going to happen. We're talking about this, right, because it gives everybody below the cover and the power to talk about it at lower levels and at multiple levels, right, and across the board.
Right, absolutely. One of the motivating factors for this interview series is to have young, aspiring foreign affairs professionals see someone that they can identify with, someone that represents perhaps their future career. When you were early in your career, did you see those kinds of examples, someone you could identify with who either motivated you or inspired you to pursue this kind of career, or was that just an earlier time you kind of had to forge your own path?
I was late. Well, late is I think relative. This is working for the federal government, or being a diplomat, or working for the CIA was not a part of our daily vocabulary. Because, you know, when you grow up in a neighborhood with postal workers, grocery store workers, janitors, teachers, subway booth clerks, you're not thinking about what are the other jobs out there. What you see is what you're thinking about. And of course, there's the trifecta of lawyers, doctors, and accountants. But other than that, I think, you know, growing up, that was not a part of my consciousness. But I think that I was a voracious reader, so that was my out.
Right.
Or that was my inspiration, and to look at the authors, look at the characters in the books, and to see the historical figures doing great things, or maybe not so great things.
Right.
A lot of not so great things. And it really wasn't until graduate school, I would say, where a friend of mine, a dear friend, who was from Virginia, right? And if you're from Virginia, you know a lot of things about federal service.
Yeah.
She's the one who said, "Have you thought about this? I have somebody that you can talk to." And the lesson there for everybody who's watching is that don't forget that your peers and your friends are resources.
Yes.
And that you don't necessarily have to find the Deputy Secretary of State or a CIA officer or the president of whatever company to get ideas. That just talking about things with your friends who have mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, family friends, siblings who do really cool stuff.
Right.
That could be, you know, just a reminder to the audience that is a critical resource that maybe you might not be taking full advantage of.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we sometimes overlook this idea of geographic diversity. We'll focus on religious or ethnic or racial diversity.
Absolutely.
Having grown up in a small town in Illinois and gone to college in the Midwest, it wasn't really something that was in my mind as a career opportunity. And it took a mentor of mine who suggested that I apply as well. Given all of that, how do you think about mentorship now that you're farther along in your career and you've risen in the ranks? How do you approach trying to inspire the next generation of foreign service professionals?
I constantly look back to the friend's family friend, I emailed him recently to say hello. Retired CIA officer. He's the one who walked me through this whole process. He didn't know me from the person on the street, right? But because of that connection with our friend, he was so kind to walk me through the process. I didn't know the process.
Right.
I didn't have parents or aunts or uncles who could walk me through any process for that matter. And he took the time to do that. And so for me, I always want to be that person.
Right.
But I also want to make sure that there is power, inherent power in yourself to be searching people out. I think that when you reach out to folks in the State Department for a coffee or a phone quick chat, that almost all of the time the answer will be yes.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of timing.
Sure.
Right?
People are busy, but
but no one ever says, "No, sorry, I can't do that." I've never seen that happen, and I've never done that myself. Okay. But be patient as well in terms of it's, we're always traveling or we're back-to-back meetings, so it's not a lack of interest, but more on the time issue. So my approach is, to say yes, but also to appreciate where they're coming from and why people are asking to talk to me.
Right.
Like what is it that they're looking for?
Right.
Really?
Some people enter the foreign service straight out of college, or after a master's degree. Others, like yourself, myself, we try a few other things in careers. Could you talk about that diversity of experience, how that has formed how you think and how perhaps you might approach their job you're currently in differently than someone who's been in this career their entire
Yeah.
life.
There's always a thread. I see a thread, and you probably see it too, Joe, which is that, my training, my first training was in academia, which is lecturing,
Mhm.
writing,
Right.
briefing. Briefing is lecturing, right? Talking to, being in front of the classroom, and that's your briefing. But we call it lecturing or teaching.
Yeah.
The writing and the research and the critical thinking, those three skills are things that run throughout. Those are the key threads, I
Right.
think. And on the diversity of experiences, you're just using those tools or those skills in different settings. And I think that it really doesn't matter what you study, because we can teach you the subject matter.
Right. It's the
I can't teach you how to write. That takes a really long time.
Right.
And so for me, I always, because I did this in college, agonizing over what classes to take. Because how is that going to get me to X place, or what's most marketable, or what's the most useful? And of course, when I said U.S. history, when I started studying U.S. history, my parents they thought I was nuts. Like, why would you study U.S. history? What kind of job are you going to get with US history?
Okay. It's not that they had expected you to study something related to your
They didn't
practice.
no, they thought law school.
Right. If not a doctor, then a lawyer.
Right. What are you going to do with U.S. history? How is that marketable? Like, what are you going to do with it? How does that make any money? And for a parent's perspective, I understand that, right? When you're scratching your way, and
Right.
where you don't work, you don't eat, right? So everything has to be kind of a means to an end, that you get a job so that you can eat.
Right.
So, I think what I did was I kind of bucked that, which is to say, I studied art history, I studied US history, I just wanted more of the history.
Right.
For me, the lesson there, and I keep saying this in terms of, don't worry about what classes you're taking and what your major is going to be.
Right.
Because as long as you have those three threads that are common.
Right.
Writing, briefing, and critical thinking.
Right.
None of that
Skill.
matters. So I would take an art history person who knows how to write and brief and do critical thinking over somebody who knows everything there is about East Asia,
Right.
but doesn't know how to write.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. Yeah, I know liberal arts education is being underfunded. We see it at universities. I think we are focused on STEM for the right reasons, but to the detriment of some of these other skills that, as you rightly mentioned, are extremely important. And you do need several years to master those skills. That's difficult to learn on the job. On the fly.
Right, but also I'm a huge fan of liberal arts. For liberal arts, you learn about governance, you learn about ethics, you learn about art, that those are different types of ways of looking at the world. And when we talk about STEM, it really should be, liberal arts should be folded into that, because we can't just have science, because people create science,
Right.
people create technology.
Right.
And we should all have the liberal arts tools to be able to create something that will do good.
Right. I could spend hours talking to you about how a historian thinks about current issues and analytically how they write and how they think as a historian, how that translates into other things. But I don't want to take all the time. I'd like to turn to questions from the audience. We've got one from Raghav Akula, who writes, "Hello, Dr. Pak. Thank you for being here. My name is Raghav Akula, and I'm a first year in the School of Foreign Service. What was your experience like going from academia to federal service? Did you have to start from the bottom? And within federal service, switching from intelligence to diplomacy?"
I came in as a mid-career at the agency. Everybody else in my cohort were 23, 24, and I was, much older than that.
Right.
That was a little bit jarring,
Mhm.
but
With a PhD.
with the
Mind you.
PhD, but I came in at a higher level, right? But I think that know your worth when you're entering any new job, right? So there's no way I was going to come in as an entry person with those writing, briefing, critical thinking skills, right? And so, but I think people should also not shy away from mid-career changes.
Right.
So I was mid-career hire at the agency. I think that was. I rose pretty quickly, I think, within the agency because of, again, those three skills, which the agency made me do better. I mean, really just hone those skills. So I wouldn't shy away from career changes but also give it time, give yourself time to really mature into the role.
I know the State Department is trying to ramp up their mid-career hiring processes and trying to encourage people who have had diverse experiences to come in and not necessarily have to start at the bottom, right? It's something we're still working on, but that's an extremely important part of diversity, for sure. We have another question from Kennedy Copeland, who says, hello, what do you wish you knew before joining the Foreign Service? Actually, you're not part of the Foreign Service.
I'm not part of the Foreign Service, so it's very different. What I wish that I had known.
Let's ask it, what do you wish you had known before you had joined
government service?
Government service, and then separately, maybe specifically for the State Department.
I wish I had known that to get a job in federal government or any kind of job, you kind of want to be in that ecosystem. You want to place yourself in that ecosystem, and you do that through through social media, right? Did not exist when I was looking at jobs. And following people on social media that you admire and respect, right? That's also social media. State Department lives on social media. So does the agency, right? So do all the reporters and journalists and all the academics live on social media. And so I would really bury myself as you're looking at jobs or junior or mid-level, burying yourself into placing yourself in that ecosystem, whether it's physically or virtually, like attending this webinar.
And would you then use social media to reach out to contacts, people who had careers that you thought you might try to join, or how would you use social media?
I would start with your inner circle and then go out, right? So your inner circle is your friends, family, your peers, right? And as you move out of those circles, and I'm talking about your high school, your college, your graduate school, your the career services office should be your best friend. All those schools have boards of trustees and alumni groups. That's your next level of circle, right? So make sure that try to get those connections stronger, right? So those connections are stronger. If you're, I'm an alumnus of X school, or I'm a student at X school, I would love to speak to you, alumni, so-and-so about the work that you're doing in X. And then you start moving out. Of course, the outer edge is the cold call. And I think you'll probably have less and less success as you move out of the circles. But if you think of it in terms of who's in my closest inner circle, and then start spreading out into your organizations, your schools, your church, your whatever the alumni networks. I think the first real task is to show up. So when your school has a alumni gathering, show up. You never know who you're going to meet. And really take advantage of the resources of your institutions.
We have another question from Aramide Apo Oyin, who asks, similar question, what is the best way to find mentorship? So perhaps not so much finding your way into an industry or building a network, but specifically, how do you seek out mentors?
I still am looking for mentors, and you're always looking for mentors. But I think, let me step back a little, and I would say, what do you want in a mentor? Not all mentors are created equal. No one knows how to be a mentor inherently. Right? so I would suggest that you really do a deep dive into why you want a mentor, right? And then find the person who might fit that role for you.
Right.
Joe, you can't be a mentor on all things to everybody, right? I can't be a mentor. I don't know. There are things I don't know. I don't have those experiences. But I would really encourage everyone to just figure out, what is a mentor to me? And what am I looking for?
Right.
And what's, what kind of relationship am I looking to have?
Sure. All right, those are the questions that we have from the audience. So I think I'll take the privilege and opportunity to ask you a bit more about your background working on history. I was always of the opinion, and I had a similar experience when I was reading diplomatic archives. I kind of thought, oh, this seems really interesting. I would like to be writing this first draft of history, as they often say about journalism. When did you first think this is something that I would like to do, and how did you make that transition away from academia? Because you did teach for a bit after your PhD in New York.
Yeah. How did I make the transition? In my mind, teaching was great. I love students, but I really wanted to practice. And I'm very conscious of what I'm doing now in terms of all the analysis that I wrote and all the everything that I'm writing at the State Department or clearing on. Those are the primary sources, right?
Right.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
Like, you are creating history that somebody 50 years from now is going to see that declassified information and use your words to cite this, right? And so I'm mindful of the legacy of that, of seeing my name. That's not I'm Korean American, right? So that my name in the archives of the United States as a source, as a primary source for whoever's going to do research later.
Yeah.
So I'm always conscious of that when I'm writing, which is such a powerful, like, amazing feeling.
Yeah.
So on the transition, I think it's I'm not just writing about history, I'm creating history in small ways. I mean, I'm not making tectonic shifts in US policy or anything like that, but we all have a role to play to that kind of, I mean, it's a ship, right? It doesn't move in jerks, but very, very slowly.
Do you miss some of in your role, you probably don't get the time to sit and analytically think or write in great depth about specific issues? Or is it something that you do get to do? I was going to ask, is that something you miss, but you're operating at a higher level now, so you have other responsibilities?
I think I'm a writer. I love writing. I've always loved writing. I do a lot less writing now, but I find that I can tell a good story.
Right.
Because of that background.
Right. Do you envision going back either into academia or to intelligence work? And you've already written a book. Do you have another book in mind?
I don't. I kind of live in the moment in terms of work. And
I'm sure there's already enough work to keep you busy. In the moment.
And I'm open to all of those things. And and I want to be flexible. A lot of some of the best jobs I've ever had, or some of the best tasks I've ever had, were something that somebody that I respected said I should do, or something that I didn't want to do, but I ended up doing.
Right.
So always keep an open mind. You never know what kind of new doors will open that you never even anticipated.
Right. I'll ask one last question then. You mentioned earlier, the United States is unique in the world with how diverse we are, how we bring in talent from around the world. Can you talk a bit more about how that translates into soft power, how the United States does and perhaps can better use that diversity in spreading our message abroad, advancing our interests abroad?
Yeah, I think we want to make sure that that we walk the walk and walk the talk.
We walk the talk. That's right.
And I think that that when you see diverse people, and I'm talking about whether it's geography or whatever, sitting across from you at a dialogue table, and the other side isn't as diverse.
Yeah.
It sends a good message that look at all these people, on our side.
Yeah, I see that a lot.
Yeah,
Flags
and
in the middle. and
It's
the-
very cool to
Yeah.
see that the US has embraced all sorts of people and look where and look what we and how we're contributing to the mission.
Yeah.
So I think just seeing what the US is, who represents the United States, I think is a powerful optic and also a powerful message for other countries.
We do have a couple other questions that just came in. One is from Annie San, who asks, have you had to navigate difficulties moving up the ranks as a woman or as an Asian American woman? Do you have any advice for that?
Somebody once said that I had sharp elbows early on in my career, and I was like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? And my first thought, I remember this was years and years ago, and my first thought was, oh my God, I have sharp elbows. In terms of, oh, what did I do wrong? Right? And when I look back, I want that, the way I would interpret that and the way I would explain that is, so what?
Right. Great. It's funny how men tend not to have sharp elbows. They tend to be confident or
Right.
something, right?
Right.
That's a criticism launched at
Yes.
women.
And so that kind of and I think it's true in DC and elsewhere, or any kind of industry, which is that you have a hall file or you have a corridor file, and that if word is circulating that somebody has sharp elbows, then that's always like a some check mark and deep in somebody's mind.
Right.
Or hiring person's mind, which is why I think it's really important that people, when you're hiring or when you're in any kind of situation, that you're conscious of what are those little nits in the back of my mind that kind of seeped in through the hall file or corridor file.
Right.
I don't know that. I think my hall file is generally good, but I think but you also have to think, who cares?
Right.
If I have a sharp elbows, great.
Right. If you're doing your job well.
Yeah, and if you show kindness to others and help, and you're good at what you do, then they can suck it up.
One more question from the audience. Natasha Talifero asks, I'm a first-year student in MSFS with a previous career and academic interest in East Asia. How have you navigated Department of State and other agencies to utilize and work in your regional expertise? With state, you were drawn in given your regional expertise. But
Yeah. Asia is a huge US priority right now with our Indo-Pacific strategy. I think with any job, East Asia or whatever, that you have to remember that there are lots of people working on that issue set, so you work on the Middle East, right? There are lots of people in the US government and elsewhere that work on this particular issue. And here we're, and whatever the issue is, knowing how to, understanding what people's roles are, or what various departments and agencies' roles are, and who is in that role is critically important to understanding or mastering your portfolio. Knowing who's over at the Pentagon working on this issue and what are they focused on. What's going on in commerce? What's going on in Treasury? Who in my own building is working on these issues, and how do I get to know them so that we have a whole of government kind of approach to issues. So I think learning, and I love learning bureaucracies. Learn the bureaucracies. Learn the structures of the system.
Yes.
Know your org charts. That's really, really important. And it's also important to know the calendar. Right. So if you are, and as a policymaker, the calendar is super important.
Yeah.
When's the next summit?
Right.
When is the next election? I'm not talking about the US election. I'm talking about when's the next election in this country?
Right.
And what are the dynamics that are going to shape that election? And what should I be doing before that?
Yeah.
So know the calendar, know the organization, know the bureaucracy, know the org chart. It seems like, like everyone should be doing that, but not everybody does that.
Yeah.
So really learn the bureaucracy.
Right.
and the calendar.
Right, great advice. Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions. I appreciate your insights very much. It's been a real pleasure. With that, I think I'll hand it back to Ambassador Bodine for any closing comments or questions you might have.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. That was superb. That covers what are the skills you need, what are the characteristics, what do you need to do to survive. And by the way, congratulations on the sharp elbows. That's a badge of honor, which you obviously understand. Your insights on how to prepare, your insights on what are the qualities to succeed, your insights on mentoring and how to find mentors and work the bureaucracy, as you say, you must understand. We're superb across the board. And on behalf of anyone and everyone who watches this video and to our audience, thank you very much for a splendid, splendid chat. And with
Thank you.
that, I will close it. So thank you all.